Dodo, Raphus cucullatus, was an extinct, flightless bird endemic to the island of Mauritius, located east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. The dodo's closest relative was the also extinct and flightless Rodrigues solitaire. Together, they formed the tribe Raphinnae, which belongs to the family Columbidae, including pigeons and doves. The dodo's nearest living relative is the Nicobar pigeon. At one time, it was believed that a white dodo lived on the nearby island of Réunion, but this assumption is now considered to be a confusion based on accounts and paintings of the now extinct Réunion ibis. Subfossil remains indicate that the dodo's height was approximately 62.675 centimeters, 2.05–2.46 feet, and in the wild it may have weighed between 10.6 to 17.5 kilograms, 23 to 39 pounds. Knowledge of the dodo's appearance comes only from 17th century drawings, paintings, and written descriptions. Since these portraits differ considerably from each other, and only some of the illustrations are known to have been drawn from living specimens, the exact appearance of the dodo in life remains unresolved, and little is known about its behavior. It has been depicted as having brownish-gray plumage, yellow legs, a tuft of tail feathers, a gray, bare head, and a black, yellow, and green beak. It is believed to have used gizzard stones to help digest its food, which included fruits, and that its main habitat was forests in the drier coastal regions of Mauritius. One account states that its clutch consisted of a single egg. It is thought that the abundance of food resources on Mauritius and the relative absence of predators contributed to the dodo's loss of flight. Although the dodo has historically been described as fat and clumsy, it is now assumed that it was well adapted to its ecosystem. The dodo was first mentioned by Dutch sailors in 1598. In the following years, the bird was hunted by sailors and invasive species, while its habitat was destroyed. The last widely accepted sighting of a dodo was in 1662. Its extinction was not immediately noticed, and some even believed the bird to be mythical. In the 19th century, research was conducted on the few remains of 4 specimens brought to Europe in the early 17th century. Among these is the only known soft tissue of the dodo still preserved today, a dried head. Since then, many subfossil remains have been collected in Mauritius, mainly from the Mare aux Songes swamp. The dodo's extinction less than a century after its discovery drew attention to the previously unrecognized problem of human involvement in the disappearance of entire species. The dodo became widely known for its role in the story Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and since then, it has often served as a symbol of extinction and obsolescence, becoming an iconic figure in popular culture. Early naturalists classified the dodo in various ways, including as a small ostrich, a rail, an albatross, or a vulture. In 1842, based on studies of a dodo skull discovered in the collections of the Natural History Museum of Denmark, Danish zoologist Johannes Theodor Reinhardt proposed that the dodo was a kind of ground pigeon. His idea was initially ridiculed, but was later supported by English naturalists Hugh Edwin Strickland and Alexander Gordon Melville in their 1848 monograph, The Dodo and Its Kindred, which attempted to separate legend from fact. Examining the preserved head and foot of a specimen kept in the Oxford University Museum and comparing it with the remains of the Rodrigues solitaire, Peziphaps solitaria, they concluded that the two were closely related. Strickland noted that while the birds were not identical, their leg bones had many peculiar features otherwise only known in pigeons. One of the original names of the dodo was the Dutch wolkvogel, which was first used in 1598 in the Journal of Dutch Vice Admiral Wybren van Warwijk during the Second Dutch Expedition to Indonesia when they visited Mauritius. Wolg means tasteless, insipid, or sickly, and vogel means bird. This name was translated into German by Jacob Friedlieb as Wolkstock or Wolkvogel. The original Dutch account called Waarachtige Beschrijving has been lost, but its English translation has survived. The Latin name cucullatus, hooded, was first used in 1635 by the Spanish Jesuit Juan Eusebio Niernberg as Cygnus cucullatus, referring to Carolus Clusius's 1605 depiction of the dodo. The Swedish naturalist Carl Linnaeus, in the 10th edition of his classical work Systema Naturae in the 18th century, used cucullatus as the specific name, but combined it with the genus Struthio, ostrix. Mathurin Jacques Brisson, in 1760, created the genus name Raphus, intended to refer to bustards, which resulted in the current name Raphus cucullatus. In 1766, Linnaeus introduced a new binomial, Didus ineptus, inept dodo, which, due to nomenclatural priority, became a synonym of the earlier name. Because no complete specimens of the dodo exist, determining its external appearance, such as its plumage and coloration, is difficult. Depictions and written records from between its discovery and extinction, 1598 to 1662, provide the main evidence of its appearance. According to many depictions, the dodo had gray or brown plumage, with lighter primary feathers and a tuft of curly light feathers at the rear end. Its head was gray and bare, its beak green, black, and yellow, and its legs were thick and yellowish with black claws. Examination of the few feathers remaining on the Oxford specimen's head showed that they were soft down rather than plumes and closely resembled those of other pigeons. Remains of dodos brought to Europe in the 17th century, and their skeletal remains suggest that they were very large birds, with an estimated height of about 62.6 to 75 centimeters, 24.6 to 29.5 inches. The species was sexually dimorphic. Males were larger and had proportionally longer beaks. Estimates of weight have varied in different studies. In 1993, Bradley C. Livesey suggested that males weighed 21 kilograms, 46 pounds, and females 17 kilograms, 37 pounds. Also in 1993, Andrew C. Kitchener argued that modern weight estimates and depictions of round-bodied dodos in Europe were linked to overfed captive birds. Wild individuals likely weighed between 10.6 and 17.5 kilograms, 23 to 39 pounds, while fattened birds could weigh 21.7 to 27.8 kilograms, 48 to 61 pounds. According to calculations by Angst and colleagues in 2011, the average weight was around 10.2 kilograms, 22 pounds. This too has been questioned, and debates about weight assessment continue. A 2016 study based on CT scans of composite skeletons estimated weights between 10.6 and 14.3 kilograms, 23 to 32 pounds. Additionally, it has been suggested that weight varied seasonally, with birds being fatter during cooler seasons and leaner in hotter ones. The dodo's skull differed considerably from that of other pigeons, being more robust, with a hooked tip and a relatively short cranium compared to the jaws. The upper bill was nearly twice as long as the cranium, shorter than that of the dodo's closest relatives. The openings of the bony nostrils extended along the beak and lacked a bony septum. The cranium, apart from the beak, was wider than it was long, with the frontal bone forming a domed shape, the highest point situated above the rear part of the eye socket. The back of the skull sloped downwards. The eye sockets occupied a large portion of the rear part of the skull. The sclerotic rings within the eyes were composed of 11 small bones, as in other pigeons. The mandible was slightly curved, with each half bearing a single fenestra, opening, as in other pigeons. The dodo had about 19 presacral vertebrae, neck and thorax, including 3 fused into the notarium, 16 synsacral vertebrae, lumbar region and sacrum, 6 free caudal vertebrae, and a pygostyle. The neck had well-developed areas for the attachment of muscles and ligaments, probably to support the heavy skull and beak. Each side bore 6 ribs, 4 of which were connected to the sternum by sternal ribs. The sternum was large but proportionally smaller than that of pigeons capable of flight. It was highly pneumatic, broad, and relatively thick in cross-section. The pectoral girdle, shoulder blades, and wing bones were smaller than those of flying pigeons, and more delicate than those of the Rodrigues solitaire. yet no skeletal elements were missing. However, the dodo's carpometacarpus was more robust than that of the solitaire. The pelvis was broader than that of the solitaire and other relatives, but comparable to some smaller flightless pigeons. Most leg bones were stouter than those of modern pigeons and solitaires, though their length proportions did not differ greatly. The traditional image of the dodo is that of a very fat, clumsy bird, but this may be an exaggeration. Today, scientists generally agree that many early European depictions were based on overfed captive birds or poorly stuffed specimens. It has also been suggested that illustrations may have shown dodos with puffed-up feathers. The Dutch painter Roland Savary was the most prolific and influential illustrator of the dodo, creating at least a dozen images, often depicting it from low angles. His famous 1626 painting, now known as Edwards's dodo, because it once belonged to ornithologist George Edwards, became the standard image of the bird. It is housed in the Natural History Museum, London. The painting shows an especially fat bird and became the source for many later depictions of the dodo. Very little is known about the dodo's behavior, since most contemporary accounts are very brief. Weight estimates suggest that males may have reached 21 kilograms and females 17 kilograms. The robustness of its leg bones indicates that it may have been capable of running quickly. Its legs were strong and sturdy to support the bulk of the bird, and also allowed it to move swiftly and nimbly in dense pre-human landscapes. Although the wings were small, the well-developed muscle scars on their bones show they were not completely vestigial, and may have been used for display and balance, as in modern pigeons. Unlike Rodrigues' solitaires, there is no evidence that dodos use their wings in intraspecific combat. Some dodo bones have been found with healed fractures, but its breast muscles were weak and the wings reduced. Instead, the dodo may have used its large, hooked beak in territorial disputes. Since Mauritius had heavier rainfall and less seasonal variation than Rodrigues, resource availability may have given the dodo less reason to develop aggressive territorial behavior. Thus, the Rodrigues solitaire was probably the more aggressive of the two. In 2016, the first 3D endocast of the dodo's brain was made. The brain-to-body size ratio was similar to that of modern pigeons, indicating comparable intelligence. Besides fallen fruits, the dodo ate nuts, seeds, bulbs, and roots. It has also been suggested that the dodo, like its crowned pigeon relatives, may have consumed crabs and shellfish. Its diet must have been varied, as captive specimens were fed a wide assortment of food during long sea voyages. According to researchers, since Mauritius had distinct wet and dry seasons, the dodo may have fattened on ripe fruits at the end of the wet season in order to survive food shortages during the dry season. Contemporary reports described the bird as having a gluttonous appetite. In 1996, Mauritian ornithologist Frans Staub suggested that they fed mainly on palm fruits and tried to link the dodo's fat cycle to the fruiting cycle of palms. Some debate surrounds the exact date of its extinction. The last widely accepted sighting of the dodo was reported in 1662 by Volkert Everts, a Dutch sailor shipwrecked on the island of Mauritius. He described capturing birds on a small islet now thought to have been amber. These animals approached us and looked at us, remaining still where they stood, not knowing whether their wings could help them to fly away or their legs to escape, thus allowing us to come as close as we wished. Among these birds were some that the Indians called dood ersen, a kind of very large goose. These birds could not fly, and instead of wings, they had only small stumps, yet they could run very swiftly. We drove them into a corner where we could catch them with our hands, and when we held one by the leg and it cried loudly, the others suddenly ran forward to help it, whereupon they too were captured. These dodos on the islet were not necessarily the very last members of the species. The last claimed sighting was in 1688, noted in the hunting records of Isaac Johannes Lemosius. In 2003, biologists David L. Roberts and Andrew R. Solo statistically analyzed the records and proposed a new estimated extinction date of 1693 within a 95% confidence interval. They also pointed out that since the last undisputed sighting was in 1638, by the 1660s, the dodo was already very rare, and thus the controversial report from an escaped slave in 1674 cannot be ruled out. The dodo is widely used as a mascot, especially in Mauritius. It appears on the coat of arms of Mauritius, on Mauritian coins as a supporter, on all Mauritian rupee banknotes as a watermark, and in the background of immigration forms. The smiling dodo is the emblem of Brasseries de Bourbon, a popular brewery in Réunion, depicting the extinct white species once thought to have lived there. There was little to continue in uncovering the truth about the dodo. Although a few live dodos were brought to Europe in the 17th century, today only a small number of remains exist. The thin, mummified head and a piece of skin once attached to it, famous as the Oxford dodo. These are the only surviving soft tissues. Some feather remains. The head in Copenhagen, part of a beak in Prague, and plaster casts of a moldy foot, the original of which disappeared in the 19th century. Julian Hume, an artist at the Natural History Museum in London and a bird paleontologist, has published around 40 articles about the dodo. He is considered the only person to have described all surviving parts of the bird. Along with these, according to him, there are about 20 or 25 fossilized skeletons with some form of skull material. However, all of these, including 2 nearly complete skeletons of single individuals and a third partial skeleton, are composite skeletons assembled from the bones of different dodos. In addition, what we have are images of the dodo from when it was alive, mostly from taxidermy or from captive birds. We also have many inherited misconceptions. The dodo almost immediately began to capture imaginations when it was discovered in the 16th century. It's just such a strange, odd bird, says Gosling. It would have stood nearly a meter tall, 3.3 feet. Nobody in Europe would have seen anything like it. It was simply this amazing creature. I think people embraced that. The biggest misconception about the dodo is that it was some kind of fat, stupid bird and deserved to go extinct, says Gosling. It wasn't. It was adapted to its environment, and it did very well. What it wasn't adapted to was rats, cats, pigs, goats, and obviously people. And only in the last few decades have people begun to question the dodo's negative image, says Gosling. That's very widespread. According to him, Fawcett's sculpture is the most accurate model created so far. Before starting work on it in 2019, Fawcett spent years learning everything about the dodo. Soon he realized it was better to avoid many of the images. Among them was the famous dodo drawing made in the 1620s by Dutch artist Roelant Savary. I can tell you there's a lot wrong with that, he says. It looks more like a swan, he adds. Pigeons don't have this bulbous, bulb-like lump on their necks. And that belly, that's just fat, mostly. Suddenly, the dodos were gone, and people began to ask, well, was this a made-up bird? Successfully creating a bird similar to the dodo would allow scientists to see how the dodo might have interacted with other species on Mauritius, says Shapiro. It would also provide more information about how engineered DNA sequences manifest as differences in physical appearance and behavior. She notes that the introduction of non-Mauritian giant tortoises to Mauritius as replacements for the extinct Mauritian giant tortoises has already helped control introduced plant species and support native vegetation. Hume says that he would love to be first in line if they bring the dodo back, but he still considers it a long way off. I don't think I'll ever see it in my lifetime, he says. They are looking at ways of manipulating genes and trying to insert them into a parent, so that it actually changes the genes before the egg develops. That would almost be like a shot in the dark. Would it come out with that big beak? Would it come out with those little wings? And then you start breeding, but it would never be a dodo. It would be a hybrid game. Gosling also has doubts. What Colossal wants to do is take dodo genes, put them into the Nicobar pigeon, and create a more dodo-like Nicobar pigeon. I don't really know if that will work. Nevertheless, Hume says that understanding the dodo's genetics can serve as a foundation for understanding a lot of things. There's a lot of research to be done, and it's all very exciting stuff. And learning how to adjust genes to increase genetic variability could genuinely help other birds, he says. For example, the pink pigeon, the last surviving pigeon on Mauritius, needs help due to inbreeding, he says. Adjusting its genes for more variability could help prevent its extinction. According to reports, a single dodo was sent to Nagasaki, Japan in 1647, but for a long time it was unknown whether it had arrived. In 2014, modern documents published for the first time confirmed this event and showed that it had arrived alive. It was intended as a gift and, despite being rare, was valued equal to a white deer and a bezoar stone. This was the last recorded living dodo in captivity. Like many animals that evolved without significant predators, the dodo was unafraid of humans. This fearlessness and its inability to fly made the dodo easy prey, but human predation, contrary to popular belief, was not the main cause of extinction. Although some scattered accounts describe the mass killing of dodos for ships, archaeological studies have found very little evidence of large-scale human predation. From the Baie du Cap caves, which in the 17th century sheltered runaway slaves and convicts, bones of at least 2 dodos have been found, although the steep and broken terrain would have made access to dodos difficult. In the 17th century, the human population in Mauritius, 1860 kilometers or 720 square miles, never exceeded 50 people, but they brought other animals, including dogs, pigs, cats, rats, and crab-eating macaques, which raided dodo nests and competed for limited food resources. At the same time, humans destroyed the dodo's forest habitats. The impact of introduced animals on the dodo population, especially pigs and macaques, is today considered more serious than hunting. Rats were probably not much of a threat to nests, since dodos would have been accustomed to dealing with native crabs. It is suggested that the dodo may already have been rare or localized before humans arrived in Mauritius, because if it had occupied all remote parts of the island, it is unlikely it would have disappeared so quickly. A 2005 expedition discovered subfossil remains of dodos and other animals killed in a flood. Such mass mortality events would have placed the species already at risk of extinction under even greater threat. Nevertheless, the fact that the dodo survived for hundreds of years through volcanic activity and climate change demonstrates the bird's resilience within its ecosystem. Although the rarity of the dodo was already reported in the 17th century, its extinction was not recognized until the 19th century. This was partly because, for religious reasons, extinction was considered impossible until Georges Cuvier later proved it, and partly because many scholars doubted the bird had ever existed. It seemed such a strange creature that many believed it to be a legend. The bird was first used in 1833 in the Penny magazine as an example of human-caused extinction, and since then it has been called the icon of extinction. The only surviving remains of dodo specimens brought to Europe in the 17th century are a dried head and foot in the Oxford University Museum of Natural History, a foot once kept in the British Museum, but now lost, a skull in the Zoological Museum of the University of Copenhagen, and an upper jaw in the National Museum in Prague. The latter two were rediscovered and identified as dodo remains in the mid-19th century. Old museum inventories mention several stuffed dodos as well, but none are known to have survived. In addition to these remains, Carolus Clusius in 1605 mentioned a dried foot that belonged to the Dutch professor Pieter Pauw. Its origin is unknown, and it is now lost, but it may have been collected during the Van Neck voyage. Today, the so-called stuffed dodos seen in museums around the world are actually reconstructions made from the feathers of other birds. Most were produced by the British taxidermy firm Rowland Ward & Co. The only known soft tissues, the Oxford head and foot, belong to the last known stuffed dodo, first mentioned in 1656 as part of the Tradescant collection, and transferred in 1659 to the Ashmolean Museum, a donation from either Altham or Thomas Herbert. Since the remains show no signs of having been mounted, the specimen may have been preserved instead as a research skin. In 2018, when the Oxford dodo's head was scanned, traces of lead shot, used in 17th century bird hunting, were discovered in its skin and bone. This indicates that the Oxford dodo was shot either shortly before being brought to Britain or not long after its arrival. The circumstances of its killing remain unknown, and the pellets must be analyzed to determine where the lead was mined.